University, for the most part, is an entirely new experience, and a challenging one at that, especially for first years like us. A lot of us will struggle with time management, procrastination monkeys, the likes, hence why we have the Successful Learning at University program in place to assist us. So I think it's easy to say that this would be infinitely more difficult on top of the aforementioned issues to have a disability. So in this presentation, our group aims to look at the issues disabled people face on a day-to-day basis within education and what exactly universities are doing to improve this.
So, just as a quick disclaimer, I'd like to start off by addressing one of the most important things when talking about the struggles of the disabled. As my group and I are able bodied, we don't wish to speak on behalf of disabled people. Their experiences are unique and ones that we're unable to truly understand. We'd also like to acknowledge that our discussion on problems they face is ultimately disingenuous. The same would apply for men talking about women's issues or white people talking about people of color's issues in relation to, well, relating it to themselves. Privileges such as being able bodied will restrict us from doing so.
Alright, so with that said, Alicia, a member from our group, conducted an interview with an Auslan teacher who happens to be hearing impaired himself. We'll call him Daniel as he wishes to remain anonymous. So he holds classes and workshops within the community, both young and old, to help spread awareness for the hearing impaired. And from the interview, we deducted the main issues surrounding disabled students. These problems tended to be the lack of services provided by school and isolation from peers. So in his experience, universities were unable to provide sufficient programs. This included aids such as note takers, which clearly took notes for them, closed captions, Auslan interpreters, etc. As a result, the student was left out of conversation and wasn't able to actively participate in class. So unfortunately, this creates a form of disconnect between the deaf/hearing impaired student and the rest of the class. So, as you might guess, attention levels within the students are negatively impacted. It becomes more difficult to stay interested in a class that doesn't actually cater to your needs. And Daniel mentions his experience with graduating from an all deaf and hearing impaired primary school to a mainstream high school. He describes it as difficult to adjust to a new environment in which he's become the only hard of hearing slash deaf person in his class. This, by extension, will affect success levels. So, a little bit of statistics for you. In 2009, 25% of people with a disability completed year 12 or an equivalent, compared to 55% of people without an impairment. So you see 55 versus 25% is comparatively slim. In the same year, 13% of people with a disability aged 15 to 64 completed a bachelor's degree or higher qualification, compared to 20% without an impairment. In the 25 to 44 age group, 58 of people with profound core limitations had no post-school qualification compared to 28%. So as you can see, there's a large gap between the abled completion rate compared to the disabled completion rate. So what are the rules implemented to better these results, or at least assist them? Laws like the Disability Discrimination Act, or the DDA, advocate equal rights. This involves opportunity and access for everyone, including those with disabilities. It also assists in employment and education, which is what we're looking at, which refers to the disability standards for education. Alternatively, the DSE. There's a lot of acronyms in the legal sides of things. So the DSE was created in 2005 under the DDA, Disability Discrimination Act. It ensures the access and participation of disabled students within education. The Act's goal is to also provide similar experience between the abled and disabled, and additionally, it aims to make the rights within education easier to understand. So, essentially, the Act supports disabled persons to attend educational environments without discrimination. Universities must comply with the standards set by the DDA, otherwise students can lodge complaints with the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission. I'd also like to mention some of the shortcomings of the laws surrounding disability. Australia's initial law for disability funding was provided by the federal government. It was a one-size-fits-all approach, so it wasn't specifically catered to the individual's needs and disability. So essentially, there was no customization based on the individual's needs. Like I said, all funding went to the provider of the goods and services rather than directly to the individual, despite the individual actually paying for the services in the first place. This law did not enable the person or their carer to receive the services and products they required. The 2011 Productivity Commission found that this previous funding model gave people with disability little to no choice in their support, as well as no certainty that they could access the appropriate support themselves. This block funding was thankfully replaced by the individualized funding packages. This was titled the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS, another acronym. The federal government provides just over half of the funding for the NDIS, with states and territories providing the rest. Taxpayers will also make a small contribution through the Medicare levy. So, though it's better than the previous model, the NDIS does still have its flaws. A structural issue with the NDIS is that there's a lack of support and funding for people with mental health issues, which affects up to 626,000 people in Australia. Disability is not limited to physical impairments, it's also inclusive of mental impairments. So hopefully the funding issues within the NDIS will be changed in the future. Our group also explored the policies for disabled students in different countries. We wanted to investigate the differences between our laws and their laws, and sort of compare them and see if we could learn something from them. For this, we researched the United Nations Act, or the UN. Under the UN lies the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act. We found this to be similar to our own legislation in that it prevented educational environments from discriminating against individuals with disability. Additionally, the Act includes reasonable accommodation for students, like ramps for those who have mobility impairments, or braille on classroom signs and stuff like that. The Act also facilitates a means for the person to learn life skills like social practices. This will allow for common ground between students and faculties within the schooling system. In conjunction with the aforementioned laws, Federation University also abides by the Disability and Learning Access Unit, or the DLAU. This unit seeks to provide on-campus services to students with disabilities. Such amenities include, but aren't limited to, an equity officer, as I'm sure you all have heard about during this class. Brayden, one of our other members of our group, conducted an interview with our university's equity officer. This interview detailed the facilities available for impaired persons and also what exactly his job entailed. Similar to the interview conducted by Alicia, we found one of the most pressing issues when it came to disabled classmates was the lack of understanding from their peers. In this, miscommunications and misunderstandings tend to occur, which created a difficult environment for the impaired individual. Typically, a negotiation toward practical solutions would be made. Someone with ADHD, for example, who is struggling with classwork, may need someone to help them concentrate in class, or perhaps someone who is hard of hearing may need a translator to assist them in class participation. These solutions are the responsibility of the equity officer and, by extension, the university. Furthermore, it's important to note that an equity officer cannot undermine the academic integrity of the course, by which I mean disabled persons are still expected to complete the course similarly to abled people, but from new approaches. For example, disabled students are required to sit exams and or hand in their assessments. However, they must be granted the facilities to do so. The university may provide extensions on tasks or assessments, for instance. This will theoretically assist the individuals toward deeper learning. And finally, as for improvements, we could talk about numbers and laws all day, but ultimately it's about the personal experience of the student. If we detach from those experiences by basing them on numbers and statistical values, then really we aren't improving anyone's everyday life. Helping others who require assistance means attentively listening and trying our best to understand. Then, ideally, doing what we can to help better the situation. For instance, schools could always try and create more disability awareness. It will assist everyone in becoming more mindful of students with disability and how disability affects them in differing ways. Additionally, more funding toward the DLAU to provide better resources for disabled students. The equity officer mentioned wanting to be proactive as opposed to reactive, which is to say, he'd like to be more prepared for what could happen as opposed to responding to a current issue with little preparation. And again, there can always be more awareness surrounding these sorts of issues. It's our responsibility as abled people to listen and be mindful, then ultimately work toward creating a better and more functional environment for those who need it.